The year is 1945. World War II is almost over. The Allies are celebrating. Champagne is flowing. Eisenhower is shaking hands with Soviet generals. Everyone is smiling for the cameras. But in a private tent somewhere in Germany, one man is furious. General George S. Patton, the most feared American commander of the entire war, is writing in his diary. And what he writes that night would have ended his career instantly if anyone had found out. Because Patton didn't see the Soviets as allies. He saw them as the next enemy, and he had a lot to say about their leader. To understand what Patton said about Stalin, you first need to understand who George Patton was. This was not a man who held back his opinions. Born in 1885 in California, Patton came from a long line of soldiers. War wasn't just his profession, it was his religion. He genuinely believed he had lived past lives as a warrior, as a Roman legionnaire, as a soldier under Napoleon. He believed he was born to fight. And in World War II, he finally got his stage. His Third Army moved faster than any force in the history of modern warfare. In just a few weeks, during the summer of 1944, Patton's tanks swept across France, covering ground that military experts said was impossible. Eisenhower called him the greatest battlefield commander he had ever seen. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied general. German Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt later said that Patton was the most dangerous man the Allies had. But Patton had a problem. He could not keep his mouth shut. In 1943, he slapped a soldier in a military hospital, a soldier suffering from combat stress, and called him a coward. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower was furious. Patton was pulled from command, but the army needed him too badly to let him go, so they kept him, and they watched him closely. They should have watched more closely. By 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final stages. American and Soviet forces were closing in on Germany from both sides. And for the first time, Patton was coming into direct contact with the Red Army. He hated everything he saw. In April 1945, Patton attended a dinner with Soviet General Dmitry Lelyushenko. It was supposed to be a friendly celebration between allies. There was food, there was vodka, there were toasts. Patton sat through the whole thing with barely concealed disgust. He later wrote in his diary that the Soviet officers were, in his words, a scurvy-looking lot. He described their uniforms as dirty, their manners as crude, and their military discipline as a joke compared to his own men. But this was just the beginning. As American and Soviet forces began to overlap in Germany, Patton started hearing stories. Stories about how Soviet soldiers were treating German civilians, about looting, about violence, about entire villages left in ruins after the Red Army passed through. Patton was disgusted, and he started saying so, out loud, to anyone who would listen. His staff was terrified, because in 1945, the Soviet Union was still officially an American ally. Stalin and Roosevelt had just met at Yalta. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were officially the Big Three, the united front that had defeated Hitler. You did not publicly insult Stalin's army, unless you were George Patton. Here is where history gets explosive, because what Patton was saying in private was not just criticism of Soviet military discipline, it was something far more dangerous. Patton believed the war wasn't over. In May 1945, just days after Germany surrendered, Patton wrote a letter to his wife. In that letter he said, And these are his actual words. We have defeated the wrong enemy. Let that sink in. The man who had just helped win the biggest war in human history believed America had fought the wrong side. In his diaries, Patton went even further. He wrote that the Soviet Union was a greater threat to the world than Nazi Germany had ever been. He wrote that communism was a disease that would spread across Europe unless someone stopped it. And he wrote that the only way to stop it was military force. He wasn't just venting frustration. He was proposing a plan. Patton believed that the United States should immediately rearm the German prisoners they had just captured, combine them with American forces, and drive east, all the way to Moscow if necessary. He said this not just in letters. He said it to his officers. He said it at dinners. He said it loudly and repeatedly and with the complete confidence of a man who believed he was absolutely right. His staff tried to stop him. His aides tried to change the subject when he started going down this road. But Patton didn't care. And then came the press conference that nearly destroyed everything. In September 1945, Patton was speaking to reporters about the denazification of Bavaria, the process of removing former Nazi officials from government positions. And Patton, being Patton, said something extraordinary. He compared the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties back home. Just political organizations, he said. No big deal. The world exploded. Eisenhower was furious. The press was furious. The American public was furious. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army the following month. But here is what most people don't know. Behind closed doors, Patton had said something even worse. In the weeks before he was relieved of command, Patton had a private meeting with a small group of officers. No press, no cameras, no official record. In that meeting, Patton talked about Stalin directly. He called him a gangster, a thug who had murdered his own people by the millions, a man with no honor, no morality, and no legitimate claim to any territory in Europe. He said that the Western Allies had handed Stalin half of Europe on a silver platter, and that future generations would curse them for it. He said that every day they waited, Stalin was consolidating his grip on Poland, on Czechoslovakia, on Romania, on Hungary. That every day they waited, millions of people were falling behind what he called, and this was years before Churchill made the phrase famous, an Iron Curtain. And he said that he personally was prepared to lead the attack. Not metaphorically, not as a thought experiment. He meant it literally. He had officers he trusted. He had tanks. He had supply lines. He believed that if Eisenhower gave the order, or even if Washington looked the other way, he could punch through Soviet lines before Stalin knew what was happening. His officers listened in silence. Some of them agreed with him. Many of them were terrified of what they were hearing. Because what Patton was describing was not a military strategy. It was a plan for a Third World War, and he was serious. On October 2nd, 1945, Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army. Eisenhower moved him to a meaningless administrative position, the 15th Army, which existed mostly on paper. It was a clear message. Your career is over. Go quietly. Patton did not go quietly. He continued writing in his diaries. He continued talking to officers he trusted. He began working on his memoirs, which he planned to publish. Memoirs that would have revealed everything he thought about the Soviets, about Stalin, about the decisions made at Yalta, about what he called the betrayal of Eastern Europe. He told friends he was going to tell the American people the truth, no matter what it cost him. He never got the chance. On December 9th, 1945, Patton was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. A military truck collided with his staff car. The collision was relatively low speed. The truck driver and everyone else in the vehicle walked away without serious injury. Patton broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down, but remained conscious. He was taken to a hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors said he was recovering well. He was talking. He was lucid. He was making plans to return to the United States. 12 days later, on December 21st, 1945, George S. Patton died in his sleep. The official cause of death was pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. His memoirs were published after his death, but heavily edited. Many of his most explosive diary entries about Stalin and the Soviets were kept out of the main publication and only surfaced decades later when researchers gained access to his private papers. Here is the question that historians have argued about for 80 years. Was Patton actually right? Within 3 years of his death, the Cold War had begun in earnest. The Soviet Union had installed puppet governments across Eastern Europe, exactly as Patton had predicted. The Berlin blockade happened in 1948. The Korean War started in 1950. The nuclear arms race began. The Iron Curtain that Patton had described, before Churchill made the phrase famous, had come down exactly where Patton said it would. On the other hand, and this is crucial, Patton's plan to attack the Soviet Union immediately after World War II would almost certainly have triggered a catastrophic conflict. The Red Army in 1945 was the largest and most battle-hardened military force on Earth. American soldiers were exhausted and desperate to go home. The American public had zero appetite for another war, and within 4 years, the Soviet Union would have nuclear weapons. So was Patton a visionary who saw the future clearly? Or was he a dangerous lunatic whose plan would have ended civilization? The answer is probably both. He was right about Stalin's intentions. He was right about what was going to happen to Eastern Europe. He was right that the decisions made at Yalta would haunt the West for generations. But his solution would have been a disaster. George Patton was many things. He was the greatest American battlefield commander of World War II. He was a man of extraordinary courage and extraordinary arrogance. He was a visionary and a lunatic in equal measure. He was a man who won a war and then watched everything he won be handed away at the negotiating table. And he could not stay quiet about it. The words he said when no one was supposed to hear, about Stalin, about the Soviets, about what he saw coming, cost him his command and possibly his life. But history proved that at least some of what he said was true. Whether that makes him a hero or a warning depends entirely on how you look at it. What do you think? Was Patton right about Stalin? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story as fascinating as we did, make sure you subscribe, because we have a lot more stories like this one coming very soon. See you in the next one.